Back before the PTSD and the self-isolation that goes along with it really took over my life, I used to periodically meet new people. And since how you earn money is apparently so important to people in our society, what's the first question that somebody asks you? What do you do? And as soon as people learned that I was a paramedic, of course, the next question they would always ask me is, oh, what's the craziest thing you've ever had to deal with as a paramedic? In those instances, my mind immediately goes to pretty horrific people in pieces, yet still somehow temporarily alive type of situations. Some of the really intense things that I've had to deal with that people really don't want to hear about when they're asking a question like that. But there really is one particular call that stands out as being by far the biggest, craziest, wildest situation I've ever been in. It was such a monumental event that not too long after I experienced it, I decided that I really should sit down and write out in detail from start to finish everything that happened, so that in the future, if I ever get around to writing my book, that can be something that I can include without forgetting too many of the little details that happened. So today I'm going to read to you what I had written after the fact regarding this crazy situation. Just before I dive in and start reading this document, I want to extend a really warm welcome to all those who have subscribed from the mention I got from Richard Ham in the Rotto Guild. So I really am grateful to have you here, and I'd love it if you just said hello to me in the comments. And of course, I'm eternally grateful to all my other subscribers, as well as to my Patreon supporter, Joanna, in particular. So let me tell you what happened back in 2005. On the 2nd of August 2005, I had been working as a paramedic for nearly 10 years. I had been just over 6 years in Toronto and then a little over 2 years up in Northern Ontario in the Sault Ste. Marie area. And quite honestly, I was starting to reach a point of burnout as I approached that decade on the job. And in particular, with working for Canada's busiest paramedic service in Toronto, it was starting to get to a point where I was really not enjoying the work I was doing anymore. And then this happened. It's funny, just the day before, I was talking with my partner on the ambulance about traveling. She was saying she would like to travel, but she is terrified of flying. I went to great lengths to tell her all about the different kinds of aircraft I've been in and how very safe flying is. And the very next day, we found ourselves responding to a crashed jetliner with over 300 people on board. I was pissed off when the station's hotline from dispatch rang. During a shift that lasts 12 hours, and very frequently more than that, our only semi-mandatory break is 1 half-hour lunch break. We had started our day shift at 7 o'clock a.m. and had not gotten our lunch break until 3:30 p.m., so we were hoping our downtime might last more than 30 minutes. However, the hotline rang just after 4 o'clock, shortly after a brief but fairly severe thunderstorm had passed over us. The dispatcher said that there was an incident at the airport and she needed us to head to the west end of the city to stand by. I figured, as with most of these sorts of airport calls, there must be an aircraft coming in with some kind of mechanical trouble, and we were needed in the vicinity in case anything happened to go wrong, which of course it never did. So I started a leisurely drive in a westerly direction from our station. The station itself was about 15 kilometers from the airport, so I turned towards Highway 401, but my partner pointed out that rush hour would be starting and I would be better off taking Eglinton Avenue across the city. So I turned around and did just that. As I later found out, it's a good job I did. When we were still several kilometers from the standby area our dispatcher had assigned us to, we saw a massive plume of smoke billowing across the western horizon. Not willing to believe that a plane had actually gone down, I now assumed that something had been struck by lightning during the thunderstorm that had just passed through. At that point, I tuned in to an AM news radio station and only then found out that a plane had, in fact, crashed at Pearson Airport. At that point, I also heard our dispatcher positioning about half a dozen ambulances at various locations in the west end of the city, getting them within a short distance of the airport without fully committing our always very limited resources until it could be determined whether or not they were actually required. Not long after, while we were still a fair distance away, our dispatcher came over the air and told us that we were to respond to Highway Highway 401 at Dixie Road, where a couple of Mississauga ambulance crews had some patients coming off the aircraft for us to deal with. We were not the closest Toronto ambulance to the scene, but we were in unusual crew configuration in that both myself and my partner were advanced care paramedics. Most advanced life support ambulances have just a single advanced care paramedic on board. So, I guess the dispatcher figured we would be the most useful crew at that particular time. I turned on the lights and sirens and started making my way as quickly as I could towards the assigned staging location. When people find out that I was at the scene of the plane crash, their first question is usually along the lines of, "So, what was it like?" I haven't been able to come up with words to adequately describe what it was like, so I'll simply try to paint a picture of the scene as I saw it. As we neared the staging location, what really stood out in my eyes was a truly massive amount of fire and smoke. But what made it really hit home was the huge tail section of the jetliner that was sticking up in the midst of the fireball. This was a real aircraft, a real large aircraft with real people inside. This was not a training exercise or a drill. It may have triggered memories of images I've seen on movie screens and television screens in the past, but this was much bigger and much more tangible than anything I had seen from the comfort of a living room chair. The rest of the aircraft was down amongst the trees of a gully and was not visible from the highway, but it appeared to be completely engulfed in flames. Huge flames, and an even huger column of smoke rising up into the sky. It was as if the earth had opened up and hell itself was rising up from the ground, greedily swallowing up this metal beast whose tail was all that was sticking up out of the inferno. And myself and a handful of other people were expected to actually do something about this. I would later learn that an Air France Boeing A340 flying from Paris with 297 passengers and 12 crew members on board had been coming in during the thunderstorm and had landed way too far down the wet runway. According to Wikipedia, quote, "After touchdown, the aircraft did not stop before the end of the runway, but continued on for another 300 meters, 980 feet, until it slid into the Etobicoke Creek ravine at a speed of 148 kilometers per hour, or 92 miles per hour, on the western edge of the airport near the interchange of Dixie Road and Highway 401, end quote. The aircraft then immediately burst into flames. All the traffic on the highway was stopped in both directions, and people were out of their cars observing this Hollywood scene that was before them. As we arrived opposite the aircraft, we found that the highway's westbound collector lanes next to the crash site had been blocked off by the Ontario Provincial Police for emergency vehicles. I was surprised by how few ambulances were on scene. I only recall seeing one, maybe two at the most, Peel Region ambulances, and one Toronto ambulance. It had obviously taken us a little while to get there, yet the first Toronto crew on scene was just beginning the process of attempting to create some organization in the midst of the chaos and establish triage areas along the highway where we could stage patients depending on the severity of their injuries. At that point, I saw only one patient, or two. I don't think I absorbed everything from the original scene because my recollection of specific details is rather hazy, lying on backboards on the highway and one or two passengers standing on the highway. They were all covered in mud and soaking wet, shivering from the cold and the shock, and they all seemed to have the same wild, unfocused look in their eyes as if they had just stared death itself in the face, which they quite possibly did. I don't know where the Peel ambulance crews were or what they were doing. The only two paramedics in sight were the crew of the other Toronto ambulance. They were on scene prior to us and therefore were in charge of directing other arriving crews, and they asked us to transport the gentleman on the backboard and one of the walking wounded to the hospital. I suggested that we wait on scene for a little bit to see if anyone with more serious injuries would arrive and to give them a hand with other patients as they were brought up out of the ravine. In the meantime, we would put the man in our ambulance so that he would not have to lie in the slight drizzle that was still falling. This was accepted as a reasonable idea, and in the meantime I pulled all our stretchers, our backboard, and the securing straps out of the ambulance and laid them on the highway. While I was in the ambulance, I heard a deep boom that sounded like a cannon going off in the distance, followed immediately afterwards by a collective gasp from all those who were on the highway. Roughly 30 seconds after that, I heard a much louder boom, like there was a cannon going off fairly close by. I looked toward the crash site and saw pieces of aircraft flying through the air. This was followed by panicked calls coming over the radios of all the firefighters and law enforcement personnel who were on the highway saying, "Evacuate! Clear the area! Evacuate! Evacuate!" My heart sank as I thought that perhaps some emergency services personnel might have been caught in the explosions, but thankfully this turned out not to be the case. In the meantime, the occasional passenger was still being carried up out of the gully onto the highway. A police officer who appeared to be wearing the heavily armed and armored uniform of an emergency task force cop asked me if we had any more backboards. I handed him the one I had taken out of our ambulance, the only one I could see, and he was about to jump over the guardrail at the side of the highway to head back down the gully when I told him he had better take some straps with him if he planned on carrying anyone out on the backboard, and handed him the ones that were lying close by. While all this was going on, both myself and the other ambulance crew were wondering why no other ambulances were arriving and were desperately trying to call for more help over our radio. Even after repeated attempts, we received no response from our dispatchers. I assumed our communication center was experiencing the same lack of organization as the scene at the highway. I found out after talking to several other crews over the next couple of days that at least 2 or 3 other ambulances had stood by within a few kilometers of the airport for as long as 2 hours that afternoon. Apparently our dispatcher was not willing to commit them to this scene, since on a normal day Toronto Paramedic Services is stretched to the absolute limit of its resources, with not enough ambulances or paramedics to meet the demand of the call volumes. Still, I was angry that these resources had not been sent in to help us, let alone the lack of ability to get hold of our dispatcher. When another potentially seriously injured patient arrived at the highway, it was decided by my partner and the other Toronto crew that myself and my partner would transport this gentleman on a stretcher, along with the original backboarded man on another stretcher, as well as the lady who was the walking wounded patient. It turns out our most recent patient was the captain, i.e. the pilot of the aircraft, and the walking lady was the wife of the gentleman on the other stretcher. I will not include any personal details about injuries or anything like that that would breach patient confidentiality issues, but I will quote a section of Wikipedia again, which says, quote, "The captain sustained back and head injuries during the impact of the crash when his seat was wrenched out of place by the force of the impact, causing him to hit his head against the overhead controls," end quote. We loaded all 3 patients in the back of the ambulance, along with my partner and a very large man who I thought at the time was a Peel police officer, but who I think was actually an immigration officer, creating a very full load in the tight confines of the ambulance. I grabbed our vehicle's cell phone to find out which hospital our dispatcher would direct us to, but found that I couldn't get any reception at our current location. I next tried the portable radio, but found its battery was dead, so my partner dug up a spare battery and handed it to me. Eventually, I got through on the portable and was directed to the hospital formerly known as the Etobicoke General. Now it's called the William Osler something or other. I notified the Toronto crew on scene where we were going so that they could keep track of where passengers were being taken, and started a lights and sirens run to the hospital. Since we were on the westbound 401 and needed to head east, I decided to exit on Dixie Road, then get back onto the eastbound lanes of the highway to head back towards Toronto. I'm glad I did, because as we were returning to the scene a short time later, we heard 2 other Toronto crews over the air who were transporting patients to the hospital saying that they were stuck in traffic on Dixie Road and had nowhere to go. I guess they had thought that the city streets would be a better bet than the highway. As it turned out, I got us to the hospital without any real holdups. When we pulled up to the hospital, we unloaded the pilot and my partner wheeled him into the ER while I stayed with the other 2 patients at the ambulance. The poor fellow on our stretcher was in an awful lot of pain and kept asking me what was taking so long. After a while, I began to wonder the same thing, but fortunately, a hospital staff member came out to check on us. I asked him to grab a gurney, and together we lifted the patient out of the ambulance and wheeled him inside. If I remember correctly, I believe that myself or someone else got a wheelchair for the other lady because she was in a bit of pain as well. Upon entering the emerge, it was clear that the hospital had heard about the plane crash and had called in all their staff, as there were nurses, interns, and a doctor or 2 all milling about in the lobby. They immediately wanted to know if they should expect the arrival of a lot of patients. I responded that there probably wouldn't be very many, since those involved were either in good enough shape to walk off the aircraft right after it happened, or they had been quickly incinerated. I was astonished when I later learned that everyone had in fact gotten out of the wreckage of the burning aircraft within 90 seconds. What followed at the hospital mirrored the chaos on the scene and the apparent chaos in our communications center. Normal procedure is for us to give a detailed report to the triage nurse. Then the triage nurse finds an appropriate bed for the patient if one is available. Then an emerge nurse does another assessment. And finally, the physician sees the patient and orders whatever tests and or treatment need to be done. I guess everyone got a little excited and decided to throw normal protocol out the window and switch into disaster mode. My partner was giving a report to the triage nurse about the pilot while I waited in line with the other man, who was still complaining loudly about his pain, and the other woman. The other hospital staff milled about in a state of confusion. One of the interns was told, or took it upon himself, to come take a look at the guy that was on my stretcher. Without even talking to me to get a report on the man's injuries, he began a haphazard assessment while the patient was trying to tell him he just wanted something for the pain. The intern kept getting distracted by what was going on around him and kept coming back to the same body areas he had just assessed. At some point, he also decided that the man's shoes should be removed, and since they were all covered in mud, he told one of the nurses to throw them in the garbage. The nurse gave him a rather questioning look, and he repeated the order, so she threw out the man's shoes, while I just stood there and bit my tongue. Eventually, it was my guy's turn to be triaged, so the intern gave up his attempt at an assessment and moved on to other things. The triage nurse decided that since this was clearly a very serious incident, she should lighten the mood first by cracking a couple of jokes. This did nothing but infuriate our patient, who continued to insist that he needed something for the pain. I stood there and tried to remain calm myself. Eventually, reports were given for both the man and his wife, and beds were assigned to them in the ER. We got them off our stretchers, filled in the doctors on our patients' injuries, and continued to answer questions about the amount of patients that they should expect to receive. Very few was still my opinion. I quietly went over to the garbage can, retrieved the man's shoes, and brought them over to his bed, where I put them with the rest of his muddy belongings. Since there had been a serious lack of blankets at the crash site for the wet and shivering casualties, and we had left what few we had with us at the scene, I asked a nurse if they had some blankets that we could take back to the crash site with us. Well, she went to find those. My partner and I hurriedly put our equipment back together and prepared to get going again. When we were finished and there was still no sign of our blankets, I began to get impatient. We were just about to leave without them when the nurse came walking down the hall wheeling a huge cart loaded with dozens of blankets. My partner and I each grabbed an armload, threw them in the back of the ambulance, and hit the road again. We thought we would be heading back to the Highway 401, but our dispatcher stated that we were needed to assess some patients that had been brought to one of the airport terminals. We had no idea where to find this particular location, but fortunately our ambulances had recently been equipped with new computer screens complete with an electronic mapping system. So, as the one behind the wheel, I followed our marked out route until we arrived at the little X on the map, which turned out to be a gate in a remote corner of the airport property with not a single toasted aircraft or even an emergency vehicle to be seen. We thought, this doesn't look right, so we asked our dispatcher for further directions. The response? There were no further directions. I drove around the perimeter of the airport a little more, but finding nothing, I returned to the location marked by the all-knowing X. There was a guy in uniform, a security guard I assume, in the booth at the gate, so we asked him if he knew where we should go. He didn't, but he got on the radio, and a short time later he came back out and said that if we followed an RCMP, Royal Canadian Mounted Police car, it would take us to the scene of the accident. So we followed this officer for quite a distance directly through the airport and eventually found ourselves in a long line of emergency vehicles on the airport side of the crash site. When we arrived, we found that in our absence, someone had gotten organized and brought over some supplies that might be useful for a large-scale incident. Someone immediately came over to our ambulance and handed us 2 cold bottles of water. And apparently someone else knew what was going on. I think it was one of our supervisors, if I remember correctly, because he came over and told us that we were needed at the terminal that the dispatcher had previously mentioned. So, before that RCMP officer had time to leave, we flagged him down again and asked him to lead us over to this elusive terminal, which he kindly agreed to do. Once again, we started on a long and winding trip through the airport. My partner asked me if I wanted the water, and I said yes, so she handed me the bottle. I took it and tipped it sideways, not realizing that, since I was busy driving, she had very helpfully taken the cap off for me already. Next thing I knew, there was a mini waterfall, and the crotch of my pants, as well as the inside of the upper leg of my pants, were completely soaked. I looked at it in despair and thought, Good Lord, now this truly is a disaster. In vain, I tried to dab my pants dry with tissues, but soon we had arrived at the terminal. Apparently, the 290 or so passengers and crew who hadn't been initially transported to hospital had been rounded up and bussed over to this location, and we were asked to assess them and determine who else needed medical attention. I was panicking, thinking that nearly 300 people were going to see my soaked crotch and think that this young paramedic had gotten scared by the big plane crash and peed himself. Man, oh man. I parked behind a couple of Peel Region ambulances, again I never figured out where the crews had gotten to, and a few Toronto vehicles. We loaded the stretcher up with blankets and equipment. I made sure that I strategically positioned myself at the back of the stretcher as we were wheeling it in so that it blocked the view of my wet crotch, and we followed an airport staff member up an elevator to the second floor of the terminal. Up there, I saw a whole heck of a lot of people milling about and, once again, a distinct lack of paramedics. There were 2 or 3 of our ambulance service's high-ranking, white-shirted supervisors and managers who were standing there supervising, and a single Toronto paramedic was in the crowd talking to people. One of the guys in the white shirts stated that they had taken the roughly 15 to 20 people who were complaining of various injuries and put them in one section of the room. They had also brought up boxes full of cold packs and paper-thin airline blankets, and we were to get to work assessing these injured folks. Of course, there was a problem. I now had to come out from hiding at the back of the stretcher. I made a beeline for the boxes of supplies, grabbed a handful of blankets and cold packs, tried to hold them in front of myself while looking as natural as possible, and went to talk to the other paramedic. He stated he had just started to assess the injured people, so I began to go from person to person, trying not to give away too many of my screening blankets, and discussed their injuries and treatment options. Eventually, it was determined that a few of them should go to the hospital, so we ended up transporting 3 more patients. I no longer recall the details of those 3, whether they were all walking wounded or if one went on our stretcher and 2 walked. My own personal disaster occupied most of my mind at that point. I believe we took them over to Humber Finchside Hospital, got them through the triage process the good old-fashioned way, and then began the task of doing all our paperwork. When that was finished, we dragged our weary bodies back to our station and tried to hurriedly restock some equipment and wash away the worst of the mud which covered everything. I believe by the time we finished our 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. shift and started the commute home, it was around 9 p.m. Fortunately, it was the last of a set of day shifts and we didn't have to work the next day. But the next morning I did get a call from a man identifying himself as one of our ambulance service's big shot managers. Not his exact words. He asked me if I had been at the scene of the plane crash the previous day, and when I replied in the affirmative, he stated that the media were trying to talk to people who had been involved with the rescue efforts. I knew what was coming. Due to patient confidentiality and service liability, I was not to talk to any members of the media under any circumstances. On the contrary, and to my great surprise, he asked me if I wanted to come down and do some interviews for newspaper and television. Not wanting to feed the bloodlust of the sensationalist media, nor to have to recount the absolute disaster that this disaster ended up being, I replied that I wasn't interested. Plus, I had other plans for the day and errands I needed to run in Toronto. For the next several days, the media kept applauding the emergency services for their heroic efforts. All I could think was, good grief, if only they knew. We got extremely lucky this time. If even 10% of the people on that plane had been seriously injured, we would have been right screwed. The local paramedic services don't have the resources to meet the demands of a slightly above average call volume. They're certainly not prepared for when the big one hits. Even dealing with this very fortunate situation was a complete doo-doo show. However, for my next few days off of work, I did what I don't normally do. I wore my Toronto Paramedic t-shirt and felt proud of what I had done. Rather than feeling my typical frustrated burnout, I felt pride in my role as a paramedic. Sure, of the 43 people that were injured, only 12 ended up being classified as serious injuries. I think the pilot ended up being one of the worst off, and I definitely didn't have to perform any life-saving procedures, but I was glad I had gotten to play the very small part that I did. This was not the most intense call I've ever done, but it certainly was by far the most spectacular. In conclusion, I'm going to quote a snippet from a small news article that I found a few days after the incident. It caught my eye because the subject of the article was the man who was lying on the backboard on the highway when I first arrived on scene and who was yelling in pain at the Etobicoke Hospital. A reporter caught him some time later as he was leaving the hospital, and the article reads, quote, Dominique Pajot, 54, a Paris businessman who had been sitting in first class, said his clothes were soaked in the rainstorm, so he carried them in a plastic bag, and was wearing a hospital gown and hospital-issue pajama pants. His brown leather loafers were caked with mud. I am happy, Pajot said. I don't know whether it's a lucky day or an unlucky one, end quote. I had saved something after all, a pair of brown leather loafers. And that's the story of Air France Flight 358 that crashed at Pearson Airport and my little involvement with it. If you want to hear more of my paramedic stories, let me know. It will maybe encourage me to start writing that book finally after all these years. Holy cow, you made it to the end of this video. That really does mean a lot to me. The other thing that means a lot to me is if you would give it a thumb up or subscribe to my channel, or maybe share this video with one person that you think would enjoy it. Cheers. Back before the PTSD and I want to extend a special welcome to those who have... When we were still several kilometers from the standby area, the rest of the aircraft was down amongst the gullies. At that point, I saw only one. I will not include any personal details of injuries or anything like that for the sake of They immediately wanted to... The triage nurse decided that since this was clearly a very serious incident, she should lighten the and tried to hurriedly restock some equipment and wash away the fly. Rather than feeling my And that's the story of Air France